Hello, my fellow weirdlings. It's Margot, and today we're talking about Pride. With June commonly known as Pride Month, you're probably noticing a lot of rainbows appearing all around you. If you're ready for a crash course in how Pride began and how the symbolism of the rainbow came to be associated with it, keep watching. Prior to 1969, it was unimaginable that any large number of LGBTQ+ people would ever gather to openly celebrate their sexual orientation or identity. Centuries of stigmatization, criminalization, and persecution effectively kept most non-heterosexuals in the closet. Coming out often came with threats of violence and ostracism from peers and family members. So how did we get from there to the highly visible Pride celebrations of today? Well, it certainly wasn't easy. Let's start with some basics before getting into the history. For the purpose of brevity, I'll be using the acronym LGBTQ+ for the duration of this video. That's actually short for the much longer LGBTQIP2SAA+, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, pansexual, two-spirit, androgynous, and asexual. I know this acronym seems to get longer every year, but that just means the movement and community is getting more and more inclusive, which wasn't always necessarily the case. Pride has also been known as Gay Pride, LGBT Pride, or LGBTQ Pride, and has become an annual celebration, usually taking place in June in the US and sometimes during other months in other countries. The purpose of Pride events are to celebrate how far LGBTQ+ rights have come, to build community, and simply to have a good time. Pride Month is about acceptance, equality, celebrating the work of LGBTQ+ people, education in LGBTQ+ history, and raising awareness of ongoing issues affecting the LGBTQ+ community. It's about being proud of who you are, no matter who you love. When society has tried to make you feel ashamed of who you are for centuries, Pride is hard to embrace, but is essential. The suggestion to call the movement Pride came from activist L. Craig Schoonmaker, who later said, "A lot of people were very repressed. They were conflicted internally and didn't know how to come out and be proud. That's how the movement was most useful because they thought, maybe I should be proud." After the social upheaval of World War II, what with women doing men's work perfectly competently and all, many Americans wanted to get things back to pre-war normalcy. This, in part, somehow prompted a national obsession with anti-communism, which led to Senator Joseph McCarthy's asinine hearings to expose supposed communists in the U.S. government, Army, and other government-funded agencies and institutions. With escalating national paranoia, anyone deemed un-American or subversive were deemed security risks. Included in this list by the U.S. State Department were gay men and lesbians, the theory being that they were susceptible to blackmail. In 1950, a report from a Senate investigation noted, "It is generally believed that those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons," and continued on to say that all of the government's intelligence agencies are in complete agreement that sex perverts in government constitute security risks. From 1947 to 1950, 1,700 federal job applications were denied, 4,380 people were discharged from the military, and 420 were fired from their government jobs because they were suspected of being homosexuals. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the FBI and police departments kept lists of known homosexuals, the businesses they frequented, and their friends. The U.S. Post Office kept track of addresses receiving material that they deemed to contain homosexual content. On state and local levels, any bars catering to gay men and lesbians were shut down. Their customers were arrested and exposed in newspapers. Cities performed sweeps to rid neighborhoods, parks, bars, and beaches of gay people. The wearing of so-called opposite-gender clothes was outlawed. And universities expelled instructors that were suspected of being homosexual. In 1952, homosexuality was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, as a mental disorder, though that was later refuted and finally removed in 1974. Early LGBTQ+ activism groups of the 1950s and 1960s had decided to pretty much keep a low profile, opting to blend into society as much as possible. This was in response to the overwhelming opposition they faced when making their existence more obvious. They urged their members to assimilate into general society, reasoning that they'd change more minds about homosexuality by proving that gay men and lesbians were normal people, no different from heterosexuals. It was also a lot safer for them. These groups, such as the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis, or DOB, pretty much provided opportunities for gay men and lesbians to socialize without fear of being arrested. They also provided legal assistance, education, and unification within their community, and attempted to educate heterosexuals as well. Over time, some members of these organizations grew bolder, as membership numbers grew across the country. At the same time, throughout the 1960s, civil rights demonstrations and Vietnam War protests were growing in prominence, frequency, and severity nationwide. With this came increasingly more frequent confrontations between protesters and the police. In 1965, members of the Mattachine Society of New York and D.C. publicly picketed at the United Nations, the White House, and other government buildings in response to news about Cuban prison work camps for homosexuals. The purpose was to protest the treatment of gay people in Cuba and U.S. employment discrimination. These protests shocked many LGBTQ+ people and upset some of the leadership of the homosexual activism groups that still believed they should do their best to blend in. During this time, gay men and lesbians were forming their own communities, but there were other groups who remained on the fringes. This included people who challenged gender expectations. The most visible representations of this were then mostly lumped together under the label of transvestites. Homosexual or homophile groups, as they preferred to be called at the time, considered the struggles of being arrested for wearing clothing of the perceived opposite gender to be parallel to the struggles of their own organizations, similar but distinctly separate. But in 1959, gay, lesbian, and transgender people staged a small riot at the Cooper Donuts Cafe in Los Angeles in response to routine police harassment when police attempted to arrest 2 drag queens, 2 sex workers, and a gay man. Cooper Donuts was a 24-hour cafe and was a well-known hangout for transgender and gender-diverse people. Onlookers began pelting the police with coffee, donuts, cups, and trash, and those arrests were never made since the police got in their car and fled. The uprising continued for the entire night when several people did actually get arrested. This was believed to be the first LGBTQ+ riot. In 1966, at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco, while drag queens and trans women were sitting inside the establishment, police arrived to arrest people appearing to be physically male who were dressed as women. Due to apparent ignorance to the seminal rule that you should never piss off a drag queen, a riot ensued. The Compton's cafeteria riot has been categorized as an act of anti-transgender discrimination rather than an act of discrimination against sexual orientation, and the uprising has been connected to issues of gender, race, and class that were being downplayed by the gay and lesbian organizations of the time. This event marked the beginning of transgender activism in San Francisco. Despite and because of the rampant homophobia of the 1960s, beginning in 1965, a somber, silent vigil called the Annual Reminder was held yearly in Philadelphia. It's described as a small, polite group of gays and lesbians. Men were required to wear jackets and ties. Women could only wear dresses. This was orchestrated to appear unthreatening to easily intimidated heteros. The event was intended to quietly remind the American people that a substantial number of American citizens were denied the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the relentless bullying, oppression, and torment of the LGBTQ+ people and their mostly quiet, peaceful rebellion was building up into a pressure cooker that was about to boil over. Those decades of inequality and repression culminated in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Lower Manhattan in New York City. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar owned by the Mafia, which was actually very common for American gay bars at the time. because being gay and catering to gays were literally crimes. Greenwich Village had pretty sizable gay and lesbian populations during this time. By the early 1960s, Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr. had put into effect a campaign to rid New York City of gay bars. He was concerned about the city's image ahead of the 1964 World's Fair, which was being held in Queens. Bars that welcomed gay patrons had their liquor licenses revoked. Police raids at these establishments were routine. Undercover police officers also went out of their way to entrap as many gay men as possible. This entrapment often consisted of an undercover cop finding a man in a bar or public park. He'd then engage him in conversation. If the conversation turned toward the possibility that they might leave together, or the man accepted a drink the officer bought for him, he was arrested for solicitation. The New York Post once described an arrest in a gym locker room, wherein the officer grabbed his own crotch moaning. When a man understandably asked him if he was all right, he was arrested. I guess empathy must have been seen as a gay trait. Most lawyers refused to defend these victims of unjust entrapment. Those that did sometimes handed over their fees to the arresting officer. It was a very corrupt system. So when police arrived at the Stonewall Inn early in the morning of June 28, 1969, and proceeded to get violent, Stonewall's patrons had simply had enough. Patrons of the bar, along with other patrons of other nearby gay bars and other people from the neighborhood, fought back. They continued to fight back the next night and again a few nights after that. This event, known as the Stonewall Riots, the Stonewall Uprising, the Stonewall Rebellion, or simply Stonewall, is considered a watershed event that transformed the gay liberation movement and triggered the birth of the modern fight for LGBTQ+ rights in the U.S. Within weeks, Greenwich Village residents organized into activist groups, demanding the right to live openly regardless of sexual orientation and without fear of being arrested. Within months, 3 newspapers were established promoting rights for gay men and lesbians. The 1969 annual Reminder occurred in Philadelphia just a few days after Stonewall. Some attendees, including Fred Sargent and Craig Rodwell, discussed moving their protest to New York, but upon being outraged at overhearing one of the organizers telling 2 women to stop holding each other's hands at the gay rights event, they decided silence and assimilation weren't going to be effective. These new activist groups adopted a more confrontational plan of action. Sargent and Rodwell, along with activists Ellen Brody and Linda Rhodes, proposed that an annual march be held on the last Sunday in June in New York City to commemorate Stonewall. It took nearly a year of intense planning and organization to make the event happen. Over a dozen LGBTQ+ rights groups were involved. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago held concurrent marches. Then known as Gay Liberation Marches, thousands of LGBTQ+ people protested in the streets to demand their civil rights in 1970, 1 year after Stonewall. These are now considered the first Pride parades. These gatherings were raucous celebrations of identity, and these early activists could already tell that it was the beginning of a revolution. It's been said that no one who was there could talk about it without goosebumps. These new marches had no formal gender-normative dress code. Participants were encouraged to be themselves. Most marchers arrived in their everyday attire, but some opted to wear more flamboyant costumes or drag attire. In New York City, they marched for 60 blocks, with colorful signs and pennants reading Gay Pride, generally spreading cheer and awareness. That first New York City Pride Parade was then known as the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, named after the street where the Stonewall Inn is located. It ended with a peaceful gay inn in Central Park. This was the gay version of a be-in, where protesters would generally just hang out in large groups and be there, and maybe do some chanting, singing, playing instruments, giving speeches, occasionally lighting some bonfires, protest stuff. In this case, it basically meant hanging out and just being gay. Activist Brenda Howard, who's sometimes known as the Mother of Pride, also coordinated a week-long series of events around the day of the march, including a dance. It was her efforts over 50 years ago that led to the week-long Pride celebration still held in many cities today. Organizer Fred Sargent later said in the Village Voice, "It took a new sense of audacity and courage to take that giant step into the streets of Midtown Manhattan." For the LGBTQ community, merely publicly declaring their existence was revolutionary. To celebrate it was extraordinary. So if you ever wonder why formally coming out is a thing, think about the history and what that brave step means to so many people. In many parts of the world, it can still lead to imprisonment or death. The early events often focused simply on participants' pride in who they were, living their lives openly, their individual freedom, and the diversity of the LGBTQ community. But in the 1980s, during the rising crisis of the AIDS epidemic, political and social activism also became more prevalent at Pride events. The celebration has been evolving ever since. In 1978, the most recognized symbol of LGBTQ pride, the rainbow flag, appeared at San Francisco's Pride event. The flag was designed by San Francisco artist Gilbert Baker. The original flag contained 8 colors: hot pink symbolizing sexuality, red symbolizing life, orange representing healing, yellow for the sun, green for nature, blue for art, indigo for harmony, and violet representing spirit. The following year, the 6-colored flag we more commonly see today was introduced. Some of the colors were changed, partially due to a lack of availability of fabric colors. In this version, we have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, though harmony replaced art in this interpretation, and purple or violet. This flag has since been adopted globally and is said to be the most universal flag in the world. Early Pride events were often met with protests and harassment. Unfortunately, that hasn't changed. But today, Pride events are much more widely accepted, with many politicians and businesses joining in. The number of participants has never been greater, not counting the pandemic era. And new Pride events are springing up annually all over the world, including cities where being gay or transgender is still frowned upon. Some events attract hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of attendees. Pride celebrations typically involve a series of events, such as dances, concerts, and drag shows, leading up to a parade of colorful marchers and floats from the LGBT community and its supporters. Global Pride Day is June 27th. Since the pandemic, it's been celebrated with live streams of concerts and shows for those avoiding crowds. Pride and the LGBTQ rights movement have accomplished a lot in recent decades. It's perhaps the most universal movement that's ever existed. Homosexuality has been decriminalized in more than 120 countries. 30 countries have now legalized same-sex marriage, and more than 60 countries now have protections against discrimination for LGBTQ people. Activists have reversed much of 2 millennia of discrimination in the space of just 50 years, beginning with those silent vigils in uncomfortable clothing, then physically fighting back, and now continuing with the joyful protests of today. In the U.S., we have openly LGBTQ people in some of our highest government offices, teaching in our schools, on our police force, and serving in the military, though it does often come with harassment. There are anti-discrimination laws in place, but keeping them seems to always be something that needs to continue to be fought for, and not every state has them. There are hate crime protections in place for the LGBTQ community, but not in every state, though this group is among the most commonly victimized by hate crimes. Same-sex couples can legally adopt children in all 50 states and enjoy a family life that probably felt impossible 50 years ago, though not all adoption agencies will work with them. Same-sex marriage was federally legalized in 2015. That was only 7 years ago. In 2016, the Stonewall National Monument was established at the site of the Stonewall Inn, which is still open for business today. On June 6, 2019, about 5 million people commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, and New York City Police Commissioner James P. O'Neill rendered a formal apology for the actions of the police officers at Stonewall in 1969. We've come such an amazingly long way. But homophobic and transphobic attitudes still exist, and can be extremely harmful, if not deadly. In 2021, 375 transgender and gender nonconforming people were murdered, the deadliest year on record. 57 of those in the U.S. This number is climbing annually. Suicide and attempted suicide rates and suicidal ideation are about 4 times higher than average among LGBTQ+ youth. At least one of these young people attempts suicide every 45 seconds. According to the Trevor Project, LGBTQ+ youth are not inherently prone to suicide risk because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but rather placed at a higher risk because of how they're mistreated and stigmatized in society. Just existing as an LGBTQ+ person has always been heavily politicized, with everybody seeming to think they deserve an opinion on a stranger's sexual orientation or gender identity. That's completely baffling to me. There's always been so much talk about perversion, but it seems to me that the real perverts would have been the nosy people preoccupied with other people's sex lives and genitalia. Imagine being obsessive enough to want to police that. There are people who don't want transgender kids or adults to even have a safe place to pee, for crying out loud. The sense of community among LGBTQ+ people is immeasurably important, when throughout time they've been ostracized and set apart as other from supposedly acceptable society. I'm sure Pride has saved countless lives around the world. If these events aren't something you enjoy, it's easy enough to just not insert yourself into them. When you protest Pride, you're protesting the existence of human beings. This isn't political, any more than your heterosexual existence is, and your chosen religious beliefs simply don't dictate how others live their lives. Frankly, your time would be better spent figuring out the boundary lines of what is or isn't your business. Pride started with a riot. Today, it's a party. Forever, it'll be a movement. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this topic and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have anything to add, share it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.